Hello everyone, welcome back. You're watching Empyrion Galactic Survival episode 158. I'm Igneous, and today we're doing something a little bit different. We're starting a new ship build. This is going to be a new hover vessel that the design I've had in my head for a little while, and I decided now would be a great time to build one because ever since we restarted in this world, I haven't had one. I left a Manta in the old world. As part of the process of getting the whole thing laid out for the early stages of the build, I came up with a few ideas that I realized might be very helpful for illustrating specifically how to refine a profile, how to make something that looks blocky look less blocky in the early stages of a build, so that you have an opportunity to see what you can do to smooth things off and make sure that you've got the shape that you want early, as opposed to finding out later that it's just a little bit off and it's going to require a major rework in order to correct it. One of the things that I came across was this idea of painting each profile a different color so that I can refer to it by that color, and there's less ambiguity and less concern that what I'm saying isn't going to line up with what I'm showing you because I'm trying to describe shapes and locations, as opposed to something where I could say this red profile right here, which sadly looks a little bit reddish orange, but it is red. If I say red profile, you know exactly which profile I'm talking about. And in this case, it's kind of like a torpedo. It's like an ellipse, but it's a little bit fatter on this end, and it's got an opening, and it comes around and it's closed on this end, and it goes back around that way. The red profile is basically, if you're not clear what I mean when I'm talking about a profile, is basically the outline of a particular shape that's significant to the design of the ship. So if you were looking at this ship from the side, this would be the most significant shape that you would see relative to its position. And if we had other elements of the ship that were also going to be significant from the side profile, then we would rough those in as well. And just basically, we're just drawing lines out of cubes and creating shapes, rough shapes out of cubes, so that we can start to see in the game what's in our head and make that connection between the two. We then also have this blue profile, which is like your front or your rear profile, depending on which direction you were looking at it. And it's mostly elliptical, like this, goes all the way around, comes back around this way. It's slightly different on the bottom than it is on the top. If you look at the top here, if you were to count the blocks from here straight across, there's 8. Down here, there's 5. And then from here straight across, there's 10, whereas here, there's only 7. Minor differences from top to bottom. This ends up being a slightly slimmer looking profile, but I can kind of look and see already that I'll probably have to make, or I would have had to make some minor adjustments to the blue block profile. I've already done that in the smoothing out process. We'll get to that momentarily. I just want to go over the basic profiles here that we're looking at. Here is a very significant profile in the sense that we've basically got a hover vessel with the main hull defined by the blue and the red profiles, and then it's being held above the ground. There's a fairly substantial gap, and it's being held up by these legs that are done in orange, with the whole idea that the hover engines will be on the underside of these legs holding it up, so that you can go over a lot of the more moderate terrain, individual trees, small rocks, things like that. You don't have to worry about them. Larger stuff you'll still have to be concerned about. You're not going to be going over an entire forest. The ship's not going to be that wide. We get the idea. And then in order to kind of lay out the shape, we've got this the yellow arch that comes around like this, that's going to be the gap between the legs laid out this way, so that it's got a little bit of a refined element to it. It doesn't look like basically the legs just sort of cut off on the side like that. There's going to be a little bit more soft curve going on the interior like that. And then we've got the legs themselves, which are a little bit more complicated in the sense that they're basically segments of an ellipse that we've put together just because we want them to follow a particular arch. And in this case, if you would imagine that this is the end of an ellipse, and then you've got the next step is 4 blocks, and then the next step is 3. Down here we've got the same thing, 4 blocks and then 3, and then it's got 3 more. If you were to put those 3, you could see that it's basically the same thing. So we've borrowed the curve from an ellipse, but we haven't borrowed the whole thing, and we haven't borrowed it symmetrically. We've just used what we need in order to get the shape that we're looking for. And then here is basically the same concept. We've taken an ellipse, and we've taken the shape out of that ellipse that we need, and we end up with this curve like this. Very simple, very straightforward. If you want to evaluate just in general terms whether or not you're on the right track with the shapes that you have in your head and putting them in the game, this is the easy way to do it, is just putting together these cube profiles. And then once they're done, once you're reasonably satisfied that that's the shape that's going to get you where you need to go, then we can go in and we can fill in and do a little bit of refining. And this is where it really sort of stood out to me, having this original block profile painted versus the unpainted blocks that I put in after to refine that shape. Made it very, very easy to see what we're talking about when we say refining and adding and filling in and making things look a little bit more complete. In this case, this worked out pretty much perfectly, all by accident. We've got these 3 blocks, this combination of blocks. This is the larger of the 22.5 degree block collection that you see right here. We've got this 22.5 degree block connects to another 22.5 degree block, and it creates a straight line across 2 blocks this way and in one. Simple, straightforward. When we take this larger of the 2 and then we connect it with these 2 slope blocks that were added a little bit more recently, we end up with a curve. It's, if you're really up close to it, you can see it's a straight line and then another straight line and then finally a third straight line. It's all straight lines, but you don't have to get too far away from it before it just sort of blends into a perfect curve. And we've got the same 3 blocks from here down here, and that's how we get that sort of thing that's going on. It becomes a little bit more noticeable with the transition from the 22.5 to the 45 degree block, but still, oops, it's pretty straightforward, very easy to see. That's the best case scenario. It doesn't always work out that way. If we come over here, trying to fill this elliptical section in, this kind of long curve on this side, a little bit shorter on this side, we can't have everything go from high point to high point because we just don't have that necessary collection of blocks. You can see here we've got 3 blocks like this, but if we were to use these curved blocks, it doesn't do like an outside curve. It doesn't do the convex curve, it does the concave curve, which actually works against us and looks worse than if we do something like this, where we've got straight and a single angle coming down this way. So this here isn't ideal. It's not perfect, but it's still a much more refined shape than what we originally had with the blocks. And because we've done this early on, where we're just messing around with that simple profile, very, very easy to make changes and tweak and adjust until we're happy with what we've got and everything flows the way that we want it to. It gets even more challenging when we get to segments like this where we've got very long runs of blocks. We definitely can't do a high point from here, straight line to there. If you imagine how many blocks would have to be in the game to let us do a straight line from one high point to another across however many blocks, it's staggering. It would require so many different blocks. So what we have to do, because we've only got this limited selection, is the best we can with what we've got. And we've got, in this case, the 3 blocks that way. We want to get as close as possible to going from one point to the other. And the easiest way to do this is to think of it in terms of this specific line here. If you start thinking of it in terms of this to this to this to this all at once, it's overwhelming. It's really, really difficult to try and piece it together and make it work. So if you start and you keep it simple, thinking in terms of what you can do to soften the gap between this 3 blocks, you end up with something that's a little bit more manageable. Same with the 4 blocks here and the 6 blocks here. Right up close, you can very clearly see it's not a perfect curve, not by any stretch of the imagination. The farther away you get, the more convincing it is. And that's kind of what we're going for, is it's never going to be perfect, but it's better than what it was when all we had was these blue cubes in place, looking very, very blocky and very, very obvious. So how do we get that transition? Is there a simple, easy way to make the decision on how to arrive at that transition the best we can with what we've got? The easy answer is if we start, first of all, we have to decide where we're going to make the transitions. We don't need to worry about this top section here, just like we didn't have to worry about this top section here. We're just going to leave that alone. But we do have to worry about this high point to this one, and then once we've worried about that, we do this one to this one again, taking it in segments not necessarily looking at each and every one and trying to figure out how to make it work that way. Just take it in segments. We can start with the smaller of the 22.5 degree pairs. As long as we've got space to put 2 blocks, we use the 22.5 degree option. As soon as we get down to this area here where we've only got space for 1 block, then we switch to the 45 degree angle. In this case, we've got as close to ideal as we can get, hitting high point to high point in straight lines. We switch to the larger of the 22.5 degree blocks. Again, we've got high point to high point. It worked out perfectly, just the way everything comes together. Same thing here. Now it doesn't work anymore, but we've started the process. So we just finish it with the 22.5 degree block, and then we fill in with cubes. And that's really, for the most part, if you're looking for an outside curve, all you can do. And again, if you're looking at it from this angle here, or this perspective, you can see very clearly it's got sort of a stepping thing going on. The farther away you get, the more convincing it is as a curve, especially if we go with a dark background. I know this one's a pretty big ellipse, and it's very, very difficult even from a distance to not make out that it's not a perfect curve, but it's still better than the original red profile that we had. The red profile is useful for getting that roughed in idea of where everything's going to be, how large it's going to be, and the general shape. Refining and kind of filling these things in gives you an indication of, first of all, how the finished shape might look, but also how difficult it's going to be to work with the finished profile once you've got everything sort of filled out. Because sometimes it's very clear that some of the blocks that you have to use to fill in a curve like this the way that you want it to are going to be a little bit difficult to work with when you start looking at making them branch out and go to either side and do all kinds of crazy things, whatever it is you have in mind. So that's kind of what I wanted to show you guys, is just using the tools available to create the illusion of certain shapes when the geometry of the game doesn't explicitly allow for those shapes to happen. It's just something that you kind of work with, experiment with. This little trick here, where to place the 22.5 degree pairs along a long edge like this, is something that you can apply to any curve that you've got that's got long segments like this, and you want to make it look as refined as possible. That's a good place to start. Once you've got all of these refined edges in place, that's when you can start playing around with different shapes and trying to make things look even more refined in particular situations. It's very, very difficult to go into those kinds of situations in detail, just sort of as an example. But you've seen a lot of my builds, possibly, if you've seen the series, and you know that usually there's a hidden secret somewhere that if you use just the right block, you can create things that you wouldn't have thought possible. But it still starts with this general concept. Rough outlines leading to slightly more refined outlines until you're happy with them, and then building out from there. So the next episode is going to be a little bit more of a traditional build episode. I don't know if I'm going to do block for block or if I'm just going to look at individual segments as we build them. But one way or the other, it is a hover vessel build, and it's going to continue until the ship is done, and then there's going to be a blueprint. So if you want to be notified about the next and future videos, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.